Today's top picks from Reuters Breaking Views: how Saudi Arabia is pushing the accelerator on reform, and why Scotland should be wary of breaking up Europe's working currency union. With me now to discuss these stories is Reuters Breaking Views Assistant Editor Peter Tal-Larsen. Peter, welcome back. You argue that Saudi Arabia, as I said there, is expanding and accelerating the pace of reform, and I know from acorns do tall trees grow, but these are pretty insignificant reforms, aren't they?
They are pretty small reforms. I mean, we shouldn't get too carried away, but on the other hand, they do actually seem to be heading in the right direction. And there's two interesting things about this. First of all, that this reform doesn't seem to have been sparked by some sort of collapse in the oil price that then kind of, encourages the government to do something dramatic. And it also is more substantial reform than what the government normally does, which is throw money at the problem. So, I mean, in the past, the Saudi Arabian government's response to the Arab Spring was basically to throw $130 billion at the economy and the people, and basically try and keep them quiet. Actually, these reforms are a bit more substantial. So, for example, the Parliament has passed this, or the body has passed this reform on mortgage law, which would make it easier and more for people to get mortgages. Well, mortgages in Saudi Arabia are 2% of GDP. In most developed countries, they're 60 to 70%. So that's quite a big gap that could close. Do we want do people in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia want to be taking on huge amounts of mortgage debt? Look what's going on around them. Yeah, obviously you don't want to kind of end up in an Irish situation, and I don't think there's any likelihood of that. But I think it's a step towards having a more balanced and a more kind of sustainable economy. There are many other things people talk about. People talk about opening up the stock market and things like that. And obviously, the government is still throwing money at the problems. I mean, for example, I think unemployment benefit in Saudi Arabia for Saudi nationals is higher than the average income. So, there are all kinds of things that still need fixing, but at least they seem to be taking baby steps in the right direction. You mentioned earlier, oil prices and the economy. Now, the government's reaction in a slowing economy and falling oil prices maybe to throw money at it, but they've got less money to throw should oil prices start to fall. And oil prices are weak, aren't they? Yeah, no, that's also a consideration, that the further the oil price falls, the less spare cash they have to splash around. And maybe that forces them to think a bit more about more substantial reforms. OK, on to Scotland. You say Scotland, if it gains independence, may want to break up the union, the currency, fiscal and banking union. That's not quite accurate, because Scotland would still want to keep the pound. This is exactly right, yes. I think actually what Scotland wants to keep the currency union, but maybe not have the economic union. And I think... Is that possible? Well, I think this is an interesting question. And if you draw the parallel with the Eurozone, you can say, well, the thing about the Eurozone is that it has a currency union without an economic union. Obviously, the whole debate in the Eurozone in the past few months has been about sort of pushing further towards more of a fiscal union, more of an economic union, more of a banking union. Well, Scotland, the Scots seem to want to have it kind of to go back in the sort of Eurozone direction and basically say, we'll keep the pound, but we'll have more economic autonomy and kind of unbundle this sort of fiscal union as well. When you think about what's happened in the Eurozone, small countries with unsustainable banking sectors and so forth running into trouble, you could imagine that happening in Scotland. I mean, remember that Royal Bank of Scotland required a huge bailout. The reason it was possible to have a huge bailout was because it was backed by the economic union of the United Kingdom. If that hadn't been the case, it would have been quite a different story for Scotland. But what about a country like Denmark, for example? I mean, its interest rates are tied essentially to the ECB rates, yet it's a small independent country with its own currency. It has its own currency. I mean, I think this is where the sort of the rubber meets the road to a certain extent. It's okay, if you want to go it alone, then you have to go the whole hog and say we also have to have our own currency. But Denmark doesn't have control over its interest rates. It has control. Yeah, but it can print its own currency if it wants to, and so and it can decouple or whatever if it wants to. So I think that's the key. That's the key issue for Scotland. So say you can say let's keep the union together, let's have an independent Scotland, but the idea that you have economic independence without a currency, without independence of currency, I think is a recipe for problems. Or something for Scotland to look forward to and take our minds off the tennis from yesterday, perhaps. Yeah, exactly, that's right. Peter, thank you very much. That's all for now. My thanks there to Peter Tal-Larsen.
Well, for more agenda-setting financial insight, do watch our US Breaking Views show every day at 12:30 Eastern, 17:30 in London. I'm Jamie McGeever. This is Reuters.